Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. I am Scott Levi, Chair of the Department of History, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the inaugural lecture of the Ohio State University program 1619 and Beyond, Explorations in Atlantic Slavery and its American Legacy. This program commemorates the 400th anniversary of the sale of the first enslaved Africans in British North America. Enslaved Africans had, of course, long been present in the Americas, but it's from 1619 that historical records first placed them in the British territories that would, a little more than a century and a half later, become the United States of America. We have an incredible program assembled for this academic year designed to explore current research into the history of this wholly unholy trade in human beings and its legacy, both in the United States and in Africa. I'm going to leave it to Stephanie Shaw to introduce today's speaker, but before I pass the podium to Stephanie, there are a few people that I would like to very much to thank for helping assemble this program. First, I'd like to thank Dr. James Moore, whose many titles include Vice Provost of Diversity and Inclusion at The Ohio State University. Dr. Moore can't be here right now because he and I were at an event. I left a few minutes early to make it up here, but he is still at that event. But he says to send his greetings and his gratitude for your attendance. It was during a lunch conversation with Dr. Moore last winter that the idea for this program was generated. And if that light bulb appeared over my head, it's because he flipped the switch. Beyond that, Dr. Moore's Office of Diversity and Inclusion has generously agreed to co-sponsor our program for this academic year. So I thank him very much. I'll look into the camera and thank you very much. I'd also like to thank John Brook, Director of the Center for Historical Research, for his enthusiasm and support in running this program, which is running alongside VCHR's regular program, which this year and next year is on democracy in a time of change and challenges. So thank you very much, John Brook. I'd additionally like to thank Simone Drake. Simone is the Hazel C. Youngberg Trustees Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies. I thank her for her support and co-sponsorship of this program, and I hope that our departments find many more opportunities to collaborate successfully in the future. If this program proves to be a success, and I have every reason to suspect that it will, it's because of the hard work and the teamwork of the steering committee behind it. Led by Stephanie Shaw, this committee includes John Brook, Simone Drake, Joanne Flores Villalobos, James Geneva, Eric Hirschdahl, Hassan Jeffries, Usman Kobo, Ahmed Sikanga, and Adam Thomas. And I thank you all very much for your efforts and for your vision. So with that, let me pass the podium to Stephanie Shaw. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming, first of all. This is, given that it's a Friday afternoon, there's probably a football game somewhere in this area. I don't know if there's one here, but maybe. It's just really nice to have so many people show up on Friday afternoon for a program like this. Thank you very much for coming. Our guest today, Lindsay, Professor Lisa Lindsay, is coming to us from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she is the chair of the history department and also the Bowman and Gordon Gray Distinguished Term Professor. She is particularly a perfect guest to start this year's program that focuses its attention on the transatlantic slave trade and its aftermath in British North America. Because essentially this is a year-long colloquium almost, well maybe not even almost, maybe precisely a year-long colloquium that actually will expand into a multi-year program that will cover a lot of the experience of peoples whose history or histories, societies, cultures, politics, economics, and the like ultimately came to span the whole world. Professor Lindsay is a social historian of West Africa, especially Nigeria. Her work focuses on women and gender, the economics of the slave trade, and on the slave trade more broadly. She's currently working on a project involving a freedman from South Carolina, a former slave, who in 1850 goes to Nigeria, relocates to Nigeria, I think, right? And the transatlantic family connections continue between these two groups of folk who were at one point in the same place. She's won fellowships from the NEH, the ACLS, the NHC, and the Guggenheim, and probably others. Those are the ones I could find. She's published in the American Historical Review, the Journal of African History, the Journal of Women's History, Slavery and Abolition, and others. And I'm sure I have said enough, but as you can see, Professor Lindsay is going to talk about Africa and the origins of Atlantic slavery, and please welcome her.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for that generous introduction. You've already heard a lot of thanks, but I'm just going to add mine to Scott Levi, the History Department Chair, and John Brook, the Director of the Center for Historical Research, and Stephanie Shaw in the History Department, and the organizing committee who have made this possible, and I will add the business manager, Chris Adams, who made sure that I got here. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon to kick off this really impressive series. I'm a little humbled about by the company that I'm in, being a presenter for this series and also being part of it. So thank you very much. As you know, the first Africans arrived in Virginia because of the Atlantic slave trade. And now my clicker has gotten stuck in my pocket. I'm just see if I can get this. All right, there we go. And this just shows you some of the volume of the Atlantic slave trade. And as you can see, it took place over more than 3 centuries, from about 1519 to the late 19th century. And over that period of time, more than 12.5 million Africans were sold at the African coast and loaded onto ships for transport to the Americas. 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. Although African slaves labored in Spanish and Portuguese colonial settlements from the early 1500s, as you just heard, it wasn't until a century later that they were first brought to the territory that became the United States of America. The Africans who came to Virginia in 1619 had been taken from Angola in West Central Africa. Here's a picture of them from Harper's Magazine in 1901. We now know that they were put on board a Portuguese ship known as the San Juan Bautista, which carried 350 captives bound for Veracruz on the coast of Mexico in the summer of 1619. When it got nearer to that destination, the slave ship was attacked by 2 English privateers, ships called the White Lion and the Treasurer, in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were robbed of 50 to 60 Africans. The 2 privateers then sailed to Virginia, where the White Lion arrived in present-day Hampton, Virginia, towards the end of August. John Rolfe, a prominent planter and merchant, and formerly the husband of Pocahontas, who had already died, reported, and here's the quote, that 20 and odd Negroes were bought for victuals, bought for food. So I'm here to provide the African background, especially on the so-called 20 and odd Negroes who arrived at Jamestown 400 years ago. And I'm basing this talk on what's already known about the African background to Atlantic slaving, most of which in 1619 involved Portugal, Brazil, and Central Africa. We haven't met before, most of us, and so I don't know how much background information you have on the Atlantic slave trade and on the African background, and so I'm going to pitch this at ground level, and please forgive me if I'm telling you things that you already know, or if you feel like this is too basic. If I start to see too many signs of discontent, I'll step it up a little bit. But I'm going to assume that this background, for some of you, will be new. My own research is on women and the Atlantic slave trade. The project that Professor Shaw was talking about was published in 2017 as Atlantic Bonds, an African-American, an 19th century Odyssey from America to Africa. But now I'm working on a project on African women and the Atlantic slave trade, which I can talk about in the question and answer period at the end if you like, but I thought that I would speak more generally about the African background to the Atlantic slave trade today. And start with the size and scope of the Atlantic slave trade and a handy resource for learning and teaching about it, as well as the parts of Africa that were involved. The key methodological innovation in the study of the Atlantic slave trade over the last 2 decades has been the manipulation of large data sets. This is a screenshot of the magnificent transatlantic slave trade database, which you can get to at slavevoyages.org, which has been recently released in its second online edition. It compiles and makes available information about more than 36,000 slaving voyages between 1514 and 1866. It is compiled from multitudes of sources. It's been an international collaborative effort over the past 20 more years. The sources include things like slave and ex-slave testimony, newspaper and shipping reports, commercial records, tax records, and it's now linked online to an intra-American slave trade database, which documents another 11,000 slave trafficking voyages between different parts of the Americas. It presents all this information in searchable fields with references to, references to the sources where the information came from in each of these views. So it's very, very handy and massive. It reveals the scale and shape of the slave trade and like never before, and it has enabled vital studies on such topics as shipboard resistance and the effects of the bans on legal slaving. I just want to show you a little bit of this in case you ever want to just play with it yourself. If you go to the transatlantic piece of this, one way of looking at it is that it just lists 36,002 entries of slave ship voyages, and it just lists them. So you can look by ship name and ship captain and where did they go and itineraries and dates and so on. So there's all of that. There's also something called estimates, where it extrapolates from what is known about the slave trade to what is thought to exist based on records that haven't yet been found, and it just gives you numbers in various kinds of searchable fields that if you do numbers of people who left Africa, it all adds up to more than 12 million at the end. But you can search it by regions of embarkation, that is to say where Africans left, or disembarkation regions, that is to say where Africans arrived. Flag means the nationality of the shippers, and there's different ways of manipulating this data. So it breaks things down by ports and regions. It's helpful for people when they're first getting introduced to this material to know what these regions of Africa actually are, how they would look on a map. So they're here. The database and historians who study the Atlantic slave trade tend to talk about quote unquote embarkation regions from Africa using this terminology. So you see Senegambia, up here the regions around the Senegal and Gambia River. Sierra Leone is modern day Sierra Leone. The so-called Windward Coast is modern day Liberia and Ivory Coast. Gold Coast is now Ghana. Bight of Benin is mostly southwestern Nigeria with some adjacent areas. Bight of Biafra is mostly southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon. And then this vast area, West Central Africa, that's mostly Angola. Southeast Africa, which is mostly Mozambique, got into the slave trade relatively late. So this is the terminology that's often used in these compendia of data. But to understand the historical context of the first Africans who came to British mainland North America, we need to look at the traffic in people from Africa in the early 1600s. So if you look in, say, early 1600s, you can see that most of this comes from West Central Africa. And I will just tell you, most of it involved Portuguese shippers, and most of it involved a traffic to Brazil. So, I'll say more about that stuff in a little bit. But what was going on there? Well, if we start at the very beginning, it's helpful to remember that before the mid-1400s, Europeans and Africans did not have direct contact with one another. But that doesn't mean that Africans were isolated or that the Europeans didn't know about them in a vague sort of way. They knew, for instance, about the thriving trade in gold that was going on across the Sahara. These are some of the major trade routes across the Sahara in what Europeanists might call the early modern period, the medieval and early modern period. It happened mostly on camels, obviously, because this is desert. And this trade was controlled at various times by the large West African empires, which in fact based a lot of their wealth and power on the ability to control this trade that was going through their territory. So the big West African empires followed in succession upon one another, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And Europeans knew about this. How do we know Europeans knew about this? Because they drew it in the Catalan Atlas, which was put together in 1375. The Catalan Atlas was flipped over. It didn't have north at the top and east and west the way we have them. So this is in a modern reorientation of it. But here's North Africa, here's Sub-Saharan Africa. This is, I don't know what river this is. Maybe the Senegal River. But here's a camel riding traveler, perhaps Ibn Battuta, who kept a chronicle of having gone across the desert in the 1300s. And here's the king that's usually thought to be the king of the Mali Empire, holding a piece of gold, a big gold ball. Here's a close-up. Here's our traveler. Here's our Mali king. Maybe Mansa Musa, who's this famous emperor of the kingdom of Mali, who is said to be the richest person who has ever lived, according to a modern website. But the point is that although Europeans and Africans were separate from one another, this gold trade attracted European attention from very early. And so I'm going to gloss over things very quickly, but when in the mid-1400s, Portuguese mariners started traveling and gathered the navigational and maritime techniques that enabled them to sail down the West African coast, one of the things that they wanted to do was tap into this gold trade rather than having to buy their gold from middlemen who crossed the Mediterranean. They wanted to come down here and buy from gold suppliers directly. So from the mid-1400s, Portuguese mariners started trying to do that. And along the way, they purchased mostly gold as they came down the West African coast, but some other things as well, some spicy pepper and some humans, some slaves. And so it begs the question, why did Africans sell people? Why did they sell slaves? I'm going to give you some specific answers in some specific times and places, but I'd like to start out with some general answers to that question. And initially try to dispel some myths about the answers to this question. So I think I've often heard bandied around some wrong answers to the question, why did Africans sell slaves? And so let me present with you the wrong answers, and then I'll try to replace those. So the first one, I think I call the patronizing view. That they were tricked or they were overpowered into doing something they didn't want to do. And the problem with this one is that I think it doesn't give Africans enough credit for making their own decisions and being able to act with autonomy. The other one is what I consider to be the blame the victim view. Slavery and the slave trade were Africans' own fault because they sold their own people. So why did Africans sell other Africans? Because they're venal and greedy. And so, and doing so made them sell their own people. So I think both of these are unsatisfactory, or rather neither of these are satisfactory, and I'll explain why briefly and then go into some more detailed information about some specific times and places. But let me start with the patronizing view, that Africans were tricked or overpowered by Europeans who got them to sell more people than was good for them, or that they wanted to. Now, it begs the question, if Europeans were strong enough to make this happen, if the power differential was so strong between Europeans and Africans, why didn't they just colonize Africa and establish plantations in Africa the way they did in the Americas? And in fact, that's what Europeans would have liked to do. Some of our sources tell us that they would have liked to do this. But the point is that they couldn't. They traded on the coast because they were not able to do what they did in the Americas. And come in and colonize. The technology differential was negligible. Before the Industrial Revolution, the technology differential between Africans and Europeans was negligible. This is an account of the King of Benin in the 1680s. It's just one of many, many things I could have shared with you. But here's a European visitor talking about the King of Benin. He's a powerful prince, and one day he can assemble 20,000 soldiers and in a short time raise an army of 80 to 100,000 men. He is also the terror of his neighbors and the fear of their peoples. They couldn't be conquered and forced to do something they didn't want to do by Europeans. Okay, so what about individual raids? I don't know, most of you don't look old enough, but there are a few of you in here who are as old as me. And you may remember, as I do, from our childhood when Roots was on TV. And in the first episode of Roots, some white guys come on the shore in West Africa and they chase Kunta Kinte. Or rather, they have some henchmen who they direct to chase Kunta Kinte, and they capture him in a net and they carry him off. And so, even if, say, the Kingdom of Benin couldn't be conquered, couldn't Europeans stage little raids like that? Spoiler alert, the first episode of Roots is wildly inaccurate. Surprise, surprise. Europeans, every so often, would try to stage, especially early on, would try to stage raids like that. But they quickly learned not to do so because it would spoil trade for the future. And the next time any foreign ship came along, those people would be attacked in retribution. And so they knew perfectly well that they couldn't just come in and raid because it only worked once. And then they wouldn't be able to trade. And so after a very early and very short-lived period of raiding by Portuguese mariners, they settled into patterns of peaceful trading. The other piece of evidence that Africans weren't forced to sell slaves is that not every part of Africa where Europeans went traded in slaves. The Ivory Coast, for instance, parts of Liberia. Where's that map? Go back. Along here, there's very, very little slaving. And in various times and places, you know, or rather in other places, at various times there was very little slaving. It kind of rose and fell depending on circumstances. And so if Europeans had been able to buy everything that they wanted all the time, then there would have been sales all the time everywhere. And that just wasn't the case. Okay, so can we make the blame the victim argument and argue that Africans are responsible for the tragedy of the slave trade because of their greedy elites who sold their own people? And to talk about this point, oh, here we go. I have a picture of a blacksmith. And the point of having the picture of the blacksmith is to remind me to talk about identity. Okay, how would this guy guy have identified himself? Well, we can't interview him, but he might have identified himself by his family, his village, the political authority that he lived under, his occupation, his religion, maybe his gender, maybe his age grade, that is to say, the generation that he belonged to. Maybe his language, maybe class. Never, if we interviewed him till the end of time, he would not have said, I am an African. Because that is not an identity. He would not have said, probably not have said, I'm a black man. That was not an identity that existed at the time of the Atlantic slave trade. That was an identity produced by the Atlantic slave trade. But to say that people, quote unquote, sold their own people is to misunderstand the nature of African social structure. So the people who did the selling were political elites and merchants, and they tended to enslave and traffic in people who were from somewhere else, who were from a different class, who were engaged in, who had different kinds of political loyalties, who had perhaps different kinds of religious loyalties. But they certainly never considered themselves to be the same people as those that they were selling. And as I'll talk about in a minute, the people who trafficked in enslaved people often worked very hard to keep their folks safe from slavery, from enslavers. So to say that they're the same people is to impose modern day categories that were themselves a product of the slave trade on a period of time when they don't belong. Africa is the continent with the longest human history, and so it is home to the greatest population diversity in the world. A king who sold war captives to a European trader likely had no more sense of affiliation with those enslaved individuals than the European did, or that the king and the European did with each other. So, and just like people all over the world in what Europeans called the early modern, or what Europeanists called the early modern period, Africans considered slavery to be a legitimate institution for incorporating, domesticating, or exploiting outsiders. The main difference between Western Europeans and Africans during the period of the slave trade was only that Europeans drew their boundaries of where insider and outsider were a little bit more expansively than many Africans did. So it doesn't make sense to lump African sellers and slaves together as the same people. They didn't consider themselves the same, and this blames the victims for something they didn't control and imposes a modern category, African, on something that didn't exist at the time. So if we eliminate the patronizing view and the blame the victim view, then why did Africans sell slaves? And the basic short answer is because, like people all over the world at the time, they saw nothing wrong with it. Let's see. All right. And to elaborate on this article a little bit, I need to make some generalizations. Historians are very fond of saying, oh, it was complicated, oh, there's more to this story than meets the eye. I'm going to do the opposite and indulge in some sweeping overgeneralizations, but just bear with me. The first thing is that in, say, 1400, 1500, 1600, in much of Atlantic Africa, there was a very high land-to-people ratio. And so a basic demographic constraint is that there was lots of land, and for ambitious folks, perhaps not enough people, because you need people if you're going to clear the bush, if you're going to start farming, if you're going to have specialization of labor. If you're going to do the things to build up a society, you need people. And if there's lots of land, what that means is that anytime somebody gets disgruntled with their political leader, they can leave and go, again, this is, I'm a little worried looking at the Africanists in the room, I'm overgeneralizing. But this meant that there was a lot of political decentralization, and that aspiring, ambitious people had to work very hard to build up followers. And they did this by seeing wealth in people. That what mattered was not land, of which there was enough, but having labor power. And so how do you mobilize labor power? You have polygamy, the ability to marry more than one wife, and therefore increase a man's fertility. Whoops. And so-called big men, men who were ambitious and powerful and successful, would compete with one another for clients, for members of their retinue, for household members. And one implication of this is to have slaves. Because if you violently incorporate people who you disattach from their societies and bring into your societies, that's a way of bringing in more wealth and people. And so this argument, which originally was made by a historian named John Thornton, is that there already was slavery at the time that Europeans showed up, because that's how ambitious people competed with one another for wealth and power. They needed to get people. And one of the implications of competition for people was the pre-existence of slavery. Okay, so how do you get slaves? Well, one way of getting slaves, you can raise them from birth, but a more efficient way of getting slaves is to transform war captives into slaves. And like Europeans, Asians, people all over the world, Africans sometimes made war on one another. There would be civil wars within polities, there would be wars between polities. They did it for all the same reasons that people all over the world made war: to compete for power, to avenge wrongs, to gain influence, to control resources or travel routes, whatever, to replace one ruling elite with another ruling elite. But when there was warfare in a context in which people were wealth, you don't kill people, you capture people and take them to add to your society. The other thing is that with lots of land and the potential for political fragmentation and Africa's long-standing diversity, there were conditions for frequent warfare. And this is because if a disgruntled person can leave and start their own polity, then you get a lot of political fragmentation, a lot of political diversity. This was one British attempt to get a handle on the political diversity of the Gold Coast in the 18th century. And I just put it up as an example. It doesn't have to be this, it could be something else. But these are all, as the European mapmaker identified it, these were all these different political units on the Gold Coast. And I'm not saying that they necessarily fight each other all the time, but if there was a reason to do so, these different units could identify themselves as different from one another politically, and they could try to capture each other's people. So this explanation about political diversity, and the importance of people as a strategy for wealth and power helps to explain why there already was some slavery in Africa at the time of its first European contact, and why wars continued to generate slaves. Now, it doesn't say anything about the conditions of slavery in Africa in the early part of the slave trade, which historians continue to argue about. And it doesn't explain why African leaders might choose to sell their captives. In fact, if anything, what I've been saying is that it's important to keep your captives, because that's a source of wealth and power. And so why then would they want to sell their captives? And the answer is sometimes they didn't. And sometimes specific circumstances of the moment would lead rulers or merchants to decide that it was worth parting with some people in order to get resources. And so I want to talk a little bit about that process as it played out specifically in some areas. I was just glossing earlier about, oh, well, when Europeans started coming along the West African coast. Well, I'll say a little bit more. Portuguese mariners began in the 1460s and the 1470s to have the technology that enabled them to sail south and then west along the West African coast. And when they did, what they were interested in is tapping into that long distance gold trade that I talked about before. And these are the sources where gold was mined in West Africa. And previous to European mariners coming along the coast, what happened was that the gold was mined in these places, and then it entered through a series of middlemen, riding on camels, into trade networks that would take it north across the Sahara, and sometimes to Mediterranean purchasers. So the Portuguese mariners came along the coast and they wanted to buy through Atlantic, they wanted to reorient the gold trade towards the Atlantic. And the first place that they encountered was Senegambia, and they came along here to the mouth of the Senegal River and the Gambia River, because here is where they could go inland and buy gold that was produced in these areas here in Senegambia. They immediately established a base on the Cape Verde Islands, which are kind of over here, and they did this as a base to gain access to the Gambia River, and from there to the kind of a back door to the trans-Saharan gold trade. They also tried initially seizing some captives as slaves to bring back to first Sao Tome and then Portugal, but Africans resisted, and they realized very quickly that they needed to move to peaceful trading, which began in the 1450s. We have a 1455 account by a Portuguese explorer, Alves Cadamosto, who was Italian in the service of the Prince Henry the Navigator. And he describes going into Jollof, a society found there. This is a picture from much later, but it'll illustrate what I'm talking about. And he says he saw slaves being used in the domestic economy. He observed that most slaves were captured in wars with neighboring countries and civil wars. And he says that many of the captives were integrated into the domestic economy, but the rest were sold into the trans-Saharan trading networks in exchange for horses. And the reason horses were important was because this was an area where cavalry on horses could go out and be part of the military. They also helped cover long distances. They were important for administration and travel and communication. Cadamosto himself bought slaves in exchange for horses. He paid with horses. So the supply of slaves, in fact, from this region can be correlated with the ebbs and flows of local warfare, which used horses for cavalry. So what quickly began to happen with the Portuguese coming to Senegambia is that they learned that when there was war captives, they were able to buy slaves, and what was demanded was horses. The second zone of early Portuguese contact, come here, yeah, there we go, they kept going, was the so-called Gold Coast. Why do they call it the Gold Coast? Because there's a source of gold right here, and they began by trying to divert that gold trade that had previously been going north, and they tried to divert it to the south. Portuguese mariners got there in the 1470s. This was an area very exciting for Europeans because of the gold trade. The Portuguese sent a delegation in 1842 that included Christopher Columbus. That's our trivia piece of information for today. They met with the local king, who Portuguese sources render as Caramansa, and they had this kind of showy ceremony with Caramansa and trumpets and incense and all sorts of stuff, and he came in with his retinue and their umbrellas, and they made a treaty in which Caramansa agreed to let the Portuguese establish a permanent trading station on the coast down here to buy gold, to repeatedly buy gold. And Karamazov just warned them that if they weren't good trading partners and they didn't behave themselves, then one day they'd show up and no Africans would be there. So again, people can just leave if the situation is not working out appropriately. And so Karamazov warned the Portuguese, okay, you behave yourselves, be good trading partners, and if you're not, we're not going to do business with you anymore. Well, that was the beginnings of the Portuguese fort that became known as Elmina, the mine. And pretty soon, the Gold Coast, not pretty soon, over the course of the next century and a half, the Gold Coast became studded with European forts. You can see all of these on a map from the mid-1700s. And all these forts were for Europeans to buy gold. This was a lucrative trading area because it tapped into the gold trade. And the reason that Europeans created fortifications was not that they were worried about Africans, is that they were worried about each other. That they were worried that each European would steal the other's gold. And so their cannons, in fact, generally faced out to sea, not inland, because they didn't want privateers coming and attacking them for their gold. So Elmina Castle still exists on the Gold Coast. Elmina, the mine, came out of that initial treaty involving Christopher Columbus and Karamazov. It got built, it got expanded and enlarged over time. Here's a recent picture from a hill inland from Elmina, but it's still there. And these days, it's a place where people go and they tour the slave dungeons, among other things. And all those forts that I pointed out on the Gold Coast eventually involved the slave trade. But it's worth remembering the name Elmina, the mine, that for its first 150 years in existence, this was a fort where gold was stored, and that it was related to the gold trade. And in fact, what the Portuguese did was ask local gold suppliers, what is it that we can pay for gold with? What is it that you need? And what the supplier, their trading partners said to the Portuguese was, we need more labor. We need people to clear the bush, to farm, to engage in mining. You got any slaves that we can sell, that we can buy? And so what the Portuguese did, in fact, was it initially engage in a carrying trade where they would purchase enslaved people from elsewhere, bring them to Elmina, and trade them for gold. Between 1475 and 1540, they imported something like 12,000 slaves into the Gold Coast. Okay, where are they getting them? Well, they kept going down the coast. They were purchasing some enslaved people at Senegal, but they kept going down the coast. And they encountered the Kingdom of Benin, which is confusingly not in modern-day Republic of Benin, which is over here, but in modern-day kind of southeast Nigeria. Large centralized kingdom. You already saw the King of Benin earlier. He can raise 80,000 troops, right? Here's another picture of him from the 1600s. Big centralized kingdom. So Europeans loved it when they found big centralized kingdoms, because then there was one person that they could talk to. They'd say, who's in charge here? And they'd go talk to whoever it was in the palace. So Europeans love centralized kingdoms. So they go talk to the Oba, the king of Benin. They promise all sorts of good trading arrangements. The Oba of Benin actually was, by the 1480s or so, was curious enough about the Portuguese that he sent a delegation to Portugal to find out more about these people. And he started having people learn Portuguese so that they could communicate with them. And he engaged in this with his eyes open, for sure. And at first they started trading with the Portuguese. With the Portuguese, they sold some of their war captives. This was an expansionary kingdom. They were sending their armies out to conquer new lands, and when they did that, they took some captives, and so they would sell some of these people to the Portuguese. But over time, the Portuguese just wanted more and more people. Now, you probably know from other sources that in the 1500s, Portuguese and the Spanish were expanding in the New World, right? 1492. And the Portuguese and the Spanish crowns were often allied through marriage. And so wherever the Spanish went, the Portuguese could supply captive people as well. So the Portuguese got to Brazil about 1500, and you'll hear this story from other people, but they began to demand, they needed more and more hands on deck. And the Benin Oba in 1516 said, no, we're not doing this anymore. And this is an example, actually, of Africans not being forced into selling slaves. So he embargoed the export of any more captives. They still were taking war captives. They still were going out and fighting their neighbors and conquering new territory and taking captives. But they decided that it made more sense to keep the captives in the Kingdom of Benin, where they could be put to work on the royal fields, and they could engage in artisanal production and so on, than to sell them to the Portuguese. I should add, before the embargo, one of the things the Portuguese traded for people in the Kingdom of Benin was bronze. And Benin became known as a center of artistic production. If you go to the British Museum these days, I find it repulsive, actually. It's full of Benin bronzes that they looted from Benin when they launched a conquering expedition in the 1890s. But the decorative heads, and these were plaques that were all put on the walls of the royal palace like wallpaper, just lined up one after the other. And this bronze would come in through trade that the Kingdom of Benin was engaged in with the Portuguese. Anyway, in 1516 they said, no, we're not doing any more. And so, Portuguese kept going. Came down the coast, they found Sao Tome, which they discovered, lo and behold, is a really good place to grow sugar, as long as you have enough people to do it. And they found another centralized kingdom, the Kingdom of Kongo. And here is where the story becomes the most extensive, because West Central Africa became, as you saw in that first slide, our first chart, the single most voluminous supplier of enslaved people to the New World. So they got to the Kingdom of Kongo, and this was a large centralized kingdom that had been formed by the amalgamation of smaller kingdoms fairly recently. And the head of state, I thought I had his name. No, where's his name? The head of state, who became known as Afonso Mbemba Nzinga, had kind of a shaky hold on authority, and so he was very happy to have allies come in from elsewhere. And he saw the Portuguese as good potential allies in his local power struggles. And so he went all in. He took a Portuguese name, he accepted Portuguese mission, he accepted Christian missionaries here. He used Portuguese titles of nobility for people in his court. They brought in linguists to learn the Portuguese language so that they could communicate with the Portuguese, and they began to trade with the Portuguese. And of course, what the Portuguese wanted was enslaved people. And what they were willing to trade was stuff that the king felt would really help him stay in office or stay in power and hold on to his centralized power. Here's Portuguese emissaries. They created a coat of arms, a Portuguese coat of arms for the Portuguese for the Kongo royal family. The Kongo royal family adopted all these Portuguese names, Don this, Don of that. They accepted Christianity, at least in part. Okay, but to understand what's going on here is you need to know a little bit more about this wealth and people concept. And in Central Africa, in the Kongo Kingdom and elsewhere, kingdoms tended to be amalgamations of smaller units. And this is an oversimplified organizational chart. But the Kongo Kingdom essentially was a network of patronage, patron and clientage, with the king on top, who distributed goods and received loyalty from kind of mid-level, I'm using the term provincial lords just to make it sound medieval and early modern. And they had the loyalty of their subjects, but the whole reason anybody was loyal to anybody is because of the distribution of resources. And so loyalty could be exchanged for access to resources. And remember, people could always just leave and be loyal to somebody else if they weren't getting what they needed out of the relationship. And kings and lords, in some senses, were in competition with one another for the loyalty of people, and lords were in competition with one another for the loyalty of people. And but people would be loyal, would be part of one or another political group for lots of reasons. Maybe the leader was particularly wise or particularly just, but maybe the leader made really good consumer goods available. I mean, we live in America. We understand the argument that political loyalty comes from the availability of consumer goods. There was a famous debate, I think, between Nixon and somebody, his counterpart in the Soviet Union, where Nixon trotted out kitchen appliances. So it's not completely unfathomable. But the point is here that when, say, the king was able to trade with outsiders and bring in goods that nobody had ever seen before, that were exotic and that were valuable, then that king was able to make those things available to the people in the hierarchy below him and get their loyalty or more firmly establish their loyalty. And that was a good reason to be able to trade with outsiders, because trading with outsiders brought in new and exotic trade goods that made people want to be in your group, that made people want to be with you instead of with that other person. Okay, so what were those trade goods? This is a really bad slide, sorry. And this is just one example that tells us, we have sources that say the same thing over and over and over. Royal African Company was the British slave trading company in the 17th century. So what did they export in exchange for slaves? European textiles, Indian textiles. Also metals, cowrie shells, beads, weapons, whatever. Look at all of this. Look at all this cloth. They basically were importing cloth in exchange for people. And it was unusual cloth. It was from India. It was from Europe. It had special designs and special colors that weren't available locally. Now, people in Congo and all over West and Central Africa, they could make cloth. It's not like they had never heard of cloth before. But they didn't have these patterns. They didn't have these designs. They didn't have these particular kinds of weaves. And lest you scoff, think about how crazy people go to get the newest iPhone. It's the same kind of thing. People wanted consumer goods, and political leaders felt that if they could deliver consumer goods, they would have the loyalty of people. I just want to show you a couple of pictures from the French National Archives. This is from some reports from slave traders in Central Africa saying, with a little swatch of cloth, saying, we want cloth like this. That's what the demand is. We want it to look like this. Because what drove traders crazy is that they thought like this year's fashion was blue. And they'd show up with a shipload of blue cloth only to find that that was so last year. And nobody wants blue cloth anymore. And now they all want red cloth, and they all want checked cloth. And so here we have slave traders sending in their orders back to France to say, we want cloth just like this. And it's about a consumer market. So to get back to my narrative, what was happening was that Kongo kings were trading with Portuguese traders in order to get the cloth to make available through their patronage networks to solidify their own position. It kind of begs the question though, how do you solidify your own position, that is to say have followers, by selling people, right? That doesn't seem to make sense. And the answer is, you try very hard not to sell your people. You try to keep your people happy by selling other things. So I've got this list of stuff that they were selling in order to try to avoid losing their own people. And the first one was, let's sell goods. Europeans might want to buy some beeswax. They might want to buy some ivory. They might want to buy this spicy red pepper that was grown on the coast. And so they, at first, the Kongo king, they would sell some more captives, but they would try very hard to sell goods in exchange for that cloth and the other thing. The problem was that with ivory and beeswax, pretty soon you use what's available locally, and you have to start going further and further afield to get it. The other thing is, let's think about the 1500s. So the Portuguese, first they settled Sao Tome, then they settled Brazil, then they start growing sugar in Brazil in the 1530s. That is to say, they want more and more and more and more and more and more slaves. And so their demand couldn't be met just with beeswax. So Kongo's kings start selling what they considered to be available people, people already enslaved, war captives who were caught on the way. But again, it was very hard to keep up with demand, with European demand, just by doing that. And furthermore, they started to run into the problem, as articulated by the King of Portugal in the King of Congo in a letter to the King of Portugal in 1526. The wrong people were being carried off. Every day the merchants carry away our people. They're being kidnapped and stolen by thieves and people of low condition, driven by a desire to have your things. And King of Congo said, this is not working. I need to pay much closer attention to who gets shipped out and who doesn't. And the Portuguese trading partners said, okay, fine, but we want you to keep selling slaves. So it proceeded apace, and even the quote-unquote surplus people didn't meet Portuguese demand. And so Kongo kings began to make war specifically to get war captives, to send out raiding parties to take captives, and to send out people with European goods to buy folks from outside the kingdom. So in other words, let's go outside, let's find outsiders and try to capture them and bring them back and sell them to the Portuguese. Now here's where things got into trouble. Well, things were already got into trouble. But from the point of view of the Kongo king. Because all of this, the point was to centralize authority with the king. The king wanted control over this because having trade goods would bring the king more wealth and power. But when they start doing this, who's going to raise the army? Who's going to actually go to the villages and say, we have a draft and we need 10 people from each village or what have you in order to raise the army? Well, the people who's going to do that is, let me go back to my chart, these folks. The middle people in the hierarchy. They're the ones who have to go raise the army. They're the ones who became the generals on the battlefield. And when these people took captives, why wouldn't they just keep them and sell them themselves? Why would they turn them over to the king? And so the problem was, by engaging in enslaving, kings were losing their hold on centralized authority, rather than keeping it themselves. And so they engaged in a fourth strategy, where is it? Which is turn inward and start to sell over. They changed the judicial system so that crimes previously paid for through fines or something else, some other kind of restitution, became payable in a slave. People had to be given as tribute. And so they began to turn in. And that whole social contract of, I'm going to make life better for the people inside at the expense of people outside, that whole social contract in Congo began to break down. And here's where Europeans, I'm going off of European sources. The Portuguese and Italian merchants who were there wrote about what was happening, and here's where they start talking about serious discontent within the Kingdom of Congo. This is like the 1560s or so. By this time there were rumors of mutinies. A couple of Congo kings died mysteriously in battle. And then in 1568, a group of outsiders known in the sources as the Jaga, which really just means people who had previously been victimized by Congo, they invaded and they were joined by the disgruntled peasantry within the Congo. The aristocracy fled to an island in the middle of the Congo River, at which point they start dispatching frantic letters to the Portuguese, help, 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 our people have turned against us. And it took a little bit of time because these things weren't as rapid as they are now, but the Portuguese ended up sending in detachments of troops from Sao Tome, which was not all that far away, and by force they restored the Congo aristocracy on the throne in the early 1570s. But by this time, the kind of glory days of Congo were over. It continued to exist, but Portuguese mariners were also, and traders were also doing business with all the intermediate lords, and centralized authority was never what it was before. This is one of the intermediate provincial lords who became a big slave trader with the Portuguese as they were trading with all of the subordinate rulers in Congo. And so it continued to exist. It continued to exist forever, pretty much. But it was not strongly centralized as it had been before. I want to save some time for questions, but I want to tell you one more quick story about Central Africa. We're still only in the 1500s and not quite to 1619 yet. And so I need to share a couple more bits of information. And that is that as the Portuguese were benefiting from the destabilization in Congo, they also began to do business further south. And they established a trading station on the coast at Luanda, which is today's capital of Angola, in 1575. And from there, they began to try to do business with the Angola, or king, of Ndongo, a kingdom that was Congo's southern, sometimes rival, sometimes trading partner. And the Portuguese landed folks there, and they started trying to trade there as well as with Congo. Their trading station was at the base of the Congo River. And they, in fact, within a year, started a war against Ndongo in hopes of launching a full-scale invasion. This is an example of how the Europeans were unable to conquer African states. It didn't work. And the reason that they wanted to war with Ndongo is a little bit batty, and that is the Spanish had just hit silver at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, and it ended up being incredibly wealthy for the Spanish. Ndongo is at the same latitude as Potosi, and so they thought there must be silver there. So they started this batty war against Ndongo, and it quickly burnt out. The Portuguese never got any further than, or didn't at the time get any further than their coastal enclaves, but they became occasional purchasers of enslaved people. And they created a colony at Angola in 1591, really just administered from Luanda. A couple decades later, in 1614, they made an alliance with some mercenary groups known as Mbangala, who were really kind of warlord bands of people, mobile people, who had been displaced by the slave trade. And the Portuguese made an alliance with these roving bands of warriors, and they broke through the stalemate and were able to push their territory further into Ndongo. I put the word Quilombo in case that means anything to anybody. I don't know if we have any Brazilianists in the room. Quilombo is the name the Mbangala used for their military camps. It's also the name that was used for escaped fugitive slave camps in Brazil. Maroon settlements in Brazil were known as Quilombo. That's what I get there. Anyway, so the wars between the Portuguese with their Mbangala allies and the Kingdom of Ndongo persisted through the early 1600s, and that's probably the wars that generated the 20 and odd Negroes brought to Jamestown, what became Jamestown, in 1619. And if that's the case, then we have to not think about them as rural people or people who were disconnected from global currents or anything like that, because if they were captured in these encounters between Angola and Ndongo, they're probably from the royal district of Ndongo. This is according to historian John Thornton, which was an urban area with 20 or 30,000 people. It was an area where Christianity was already familiar because Kongo had been Christian at this point for 100 years. And these cultural ideas spread. It was an area where people knew very well about the Portuguese. And so what Thornton says about these captives is that they were quote unquote Atlantic Creoles, that it's people who were very familiar with the wider Atlantic world. One more quick story and then I'll stop, which is that after 1621, oh, there they are, sorry. The main dynamic, there's sort of the breakdown of civil authority in Congo. There's Portuguese Angola, where they had their Mbangala allies and they're trying to push into Ndongo. And in the 1620s or so, the headship of Ndongo passed to the sister of the king. The king died. His sister became head of state, so to speak. This is Queen Nzinga. Queen Nzinga has a statue in the Jamestown Museum, of all things. So this is worth saying a little something about Queen Nzinga since they're claiming her in Jamestown. She became the leader of Ndongo, this other kingdom, Central African kingdom. And over the decades after she became head of state in the 1620s, she alternately fought with and traded with the Portuguese. Portuguese worked very hard to destabilize her. And in fact, they fought a number of wars with her, which the historian John Thornton calls the Wars of Ndongo Succession. One of the things that they hated about her was that she harbored fugitives from Portuguese Angola, and she allowed them to come into Ndongo. At one point in the 1650s, there was so much kind of heat between the Portuguese and Ndongo that she picked up her court and had it moved. Do I have another move? Yes. And they just essentially moved into an area previously known as Matamba and said, okay, we're going to be here now. And so Queen Nzinga, in the historical sources, is known as the Queen of Ndongo and Matamba. But anyway, she built this strong army. They alternately resisted the Portuguese and fought with them. Finally, in the 1650s, there's Ndongo Matamba. There were negotiations between Nzinga and the Portuguese, at which, according to the Portuguese sources, they kind of tried to intimidate her by trying to get her to sit on the floor. They brought in these nice chairs for the Portuguese dignitaries, and they wanted her to just like be at their feet or something. So she of course shows up with a retinue of people and immediately turned to one of her people with her, and can you tell what this is? That's a human, yeah, and that's her seat. She was not going to sit on the floor at the feet of the Portuguese negotiators. So they hashed out a peace treaty between 1654 and 1656, by which they agreed to stop fighting, and Nzinga agreed to sell on a regular basis enslaved people to the Portuguese. Queen Nzinga died a peaceful death at the age of 80. 80 in 1663. And Portugal would not have control of the interior of Angola until the 20th century. Today, Queen Nzinga is remembered as a national heroine in Angola for her political and diplomatic acumen, her great wit and intelligence, her brilliant military tactics. A major street in Luanda is named after her. A statue of her was erected in an impressive square. But it's worth remembering that she did sell slaves to the Portuguese. So it's this very ambiguous kind of legacy. And this leads to the conclusion, sorry, you've waited a long time, this has gone on for a long time. The Queen Nzinga is a good example that Africans weren't forced or tricked into the slave trade, and that participation in it was voluntary by leaders who were attempting to empower and protect their own people by exploiting others. But there was a central dynamic, and that is, and Nzinga, I think, encapsulates this, which is that once the slave trade was established, rulers had to stay in it to protect their own people from other slave trading leaders or merchants, and to strengthen their own societies. So, in other words, if you don't stay in it, you will become a victim of it. So, I'll just leave you with a question. What does this say about African agency in the slave trade when it was entered through Africans' own volition, but they found it very difficult or impossible to disengage? All right, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions if you like, but thank you for your patience through all of that.
Feel free to please put your hands up.
My question is, what's the historic implication of the precedent in European history? We know that slavery as an institution existed in the past, during the Greek, during the Roman. There's even through 18th centuries there's masonry, and there are like soldiers. This is the chevalier the Portuguese, fortune soldier. So therefore, it's an experience that really existed. So is there any implications of that experience? So meaning Europeans already had like a knowledge already that they used.
Europeans already knew about slavery.
Yes.
Sure, I mean, so did everybody in the world. There was slavery in Asia, there was slavery in the Americas, there was slavery, and so yes, I agree with the premise of your question, that Europeans were familiar with it. And so it wasn't a stretch then to go down the West African coast and to try to buy some enslaved people. But what came of that was of a new scale and of a new quality. I have one more slide, in fact, that I didn't have a reason to show you, but I decided to throw it in. That's the scale of the Atlantic slave trade past the period of time that I've been talking about, all the way to 1867, and it's by African regions that came from it. But you can see how enormous this scale of slaving became. And so, yes, Europeans had done it before, but But what they did during this period was new in scale.
Wasn't there any instance where whether the Portuguese or Europeans fought Africans in order to, or as at that time, the indigenous people in order to acquire slaves? Not even an instance.
Yes, they did in Central Africa. They fought Africans in order to acquire slaves. But they mostly found it more useful to just be the purchasers of the coast.
Okay, so it is not outright that it was Africans' own evolution in selling Africans or other people, not their people, like you said, they patronizing.
Yes, Africans did sell other Africans, but at the time that happened, they certainly didn't think of themselves as all Africans. They thought of themselves as quite different. The reason we think of Africans as part of one identity today is because of that history of slave trading and colonization.
Okay, so if they fought Africans in order to get some or acquire slaves,
If Europeans did?
yes, then of course there is an instance where Africans were forced into slavery.
That's true, that's true. Yeah, so my, my blanket point went too far.
Yes.
Yes.
Then secondly, did Arabs take part in the Atlantic slave trade?
The Atlantic slave trade, again, you might find some exception, but I'm going to say no. Arabs certainly took part in the trans-Saharan slave trade, Mediterranean slave trades, East African slave trade, but not the Atlantic slave trade. That's not where they did business.
Thanks for the talk. I come to this from literature, not from history, because I'm not a historian. I was interested particularly in when things shifted from wealth in person, at the level of idea, wealth in person to wealth in things. Is there a break? Is there any point that one
You mean
can-
in African history?
Yeah, in the way, in the narrative, in the story, the account given, that prior to, even up till now, many people still argue that big men, wealth in persons, how you distribute large shares, they actually call it stomach infrastructure.
Yeah.
They actually call it
Politics of the belly.
Yeah, politics of the belly. But when did things shift from wealth in persons, where you keep people, to wealth in things, where they become, perhaps people themselves begin to be seen as things? Is there?
It has to have been during the period of the slave trade. You know, and probably different periods of time for different regions as they were more fully involved in this Atlantic economy. But I think even when say, merchants and political leaders were at their most involved in the slave trade, I think it was not necessarily the case that wealth in people and wealth in things were considered just utterly distinct. And so in order to have wealth in people, you had to have wealth in things, and vice versa. So, you know, and any given person, in fact, could at some points be an insider and at some point be considered a sellable outsider, depending on the context. And so I want to agree with you that the slave trade transformed how people looked at one another and political loyalties. But I don't want to say that they completely transformed them, because I think you're right in that this notion of wealth in people still persists in some ways, but it came to coexist with wealth and things, and people and things came to be sometimes interchangeable.
Oh, well, thank you for your talk. You know, that was a really interesting historical event that you told at the very end about the woman. And I was wondering if she was unique, or if you could talk more about the issues of gender and women, which is a very broad subject, but I just wanted to hear more.
She wasn't the only female African leader in this time. She wasn't the only female African slave trader. Most of them were men. By far, most of them were men. But there were some women. Her sister Barbara, as a matter of fact, was one of her closest confidants, and the Portuguese took her sister Barbara hostage and kept her for like 30 years. During which time, emissaries were going back and forth between Ndongo and the Portuguese, helping Nzinga and her sister to communicate with one another. So anyway, female leadership wasn't entirely unheard of, but it was relatively rare.
I was wondering, is there any time, like in the time period you covered in today's lecture, or a later time period, where someone from the, say, like Kongo royal family went to the others, like Brazil, or Jamestown? Did they ever witness like, what happened on the other side of the Atlantic? And if so, what was their reaction?
I don't know this literature well enough to give you names, but I have a vague sense that yes, that's true. One of the things leaders in Congo, and especially, I didn't talk about West Africa because most of those big dynamics were later. The kingdom of Dahomey in the 1700s was a big slave trader, and that king, series of kings, would send political enemies into slavery in Brazil. Often, most of the time, Brazil. And then, when the political winds changed, they would send people to go get them and bring them back. And so from Dahomey in particular, I think also from Central Africa, but I know the West African stuff better, that you had these people in the royal household who had experienced slavery in Brazil and then been retrieved and brought back. But it gets back to the point about identity. Just like in other parts of the world and in other times, we don't assume that elites have the interests of the downtrodden in their heart. We need to also get our heads around that African elites didn't necessarily have the best interests of the ordinary people in their consciousness. And so just because an elite person in the royal household knew what slavery was like, that didn't mean that that person then was going to become an anti-slavery activist. They just wanted to make sure that nobody they knew and cared about was enslaved and sold into slavery. And this is the other point to make about this, is that until the late 18th century, I'm going to go out on a limb and say nobody in the world led an organized movement that said slavery as an institution is illegitimate. People didn't like slavery. They didn't want their family to be enslaved. They didn't want people they knew to be enslaved. There were slave revolts from the time of Spartacus where people wanted to get out of slavery, but nobody said this is an illegitimate institution that should not exist, period. And I think that was true even of people who had experienced it themselves.
Thank you. Also, I'll add that for this opening contribution to our. I also wanted to say something because I wanted to make a correction to this opening of this colloquy. No, not colloquium. But this discussion that we're going to have that's going to last, for a long time. I want to ask you a question. I had an undergraduate student a couple of years ago who became intrigued by this story that I had told her that recurs in the WPA slave narratives about people being tricked onto slave ships on the African coast with red cloth, with pieces of red cloth scattered along paths, and they would follow it, and they would end up on the coast in these slave ships. And this, in probably that story is in a couple dozen WPA slave narratives that come from different states. They're not all from the same states, and even when they're in the same states, the slave or the different slaves are not from that place. They've been moved from here and there, whatever. So anyway, the persons who are telling these stories are not from the same place in the U.S., in the states, in the southern states. So she decided she wanted to do a major research project on this phenomenon, because, I mean, I said to her, I said, maybe the first couple of people will follow those little pieces of red cloth, but people aren't going to keep following these pieces of red cloth. And she did some really interesting research and traced it back to that textiles, to the textiles, to the colors, to the availability of colors, to certain colors coming to signify a certain kind of status, a certain kind of class, and those kinds of things. And I just wanted to ask, if you've read any of the WPA narratives, and if you know of any other stories that are in them that can connect, these stories that get told on this side of the Atlantic that seem like fairy tales, that actually turn out to have some, she did some really wonderful research and came to some really interesting conclusions that are probably really solid.
You're making me think I need to read the WPA research I haven't done. No, but I think you're right. And what happens with a lot of stories like that is that they may not be literally true, but they contain a larger truth.
Right. Yeah.
And the larger truth that you've identified is that people were being traded for cloth.
And that's very critical to the other side, the example you just gave. On the other side, you rarely hear stories from the slave's perspective. For example, all we had from your talk, from what I kept hearing was the records of the slave shippers and traders and their interactions with kings on the other side. You rarely hear if I study Yoruba society in Southwestern Nigeria, slaves don't talk. There are no oral traditions of the slaves. And that's what keeps nagging me when I was listening to you. That how would this story have been if that kind of person, those people telling the stories or following red cloth how would I have listened to it, even it was totally fairy stuff in West Africa of slaves, of descendants of slaves, talking about themselves. That keeps bothering me every time I read accounts of slavery.
Yeah, well, there are probably, like 20 survivors' accounts of the Middle Passage, people who wrote about what they endured, and those are incredible and really valuable, but some of them are just tiny little fragments. Only one, as far as I know, is by a woman. And the one that's the most extensive, by Olodequiano, now people dispute whether he really experienced it or not. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't, and historians have to be creative and mine different kinds of sources like songs or rituals or other kinds of stories or these kinds of stories to try to figure it out. No, thank you. Yes.
A point of clarification. I come from what used to be the Gold Coast. What is Ghana now? Yeah. And I heard you say that Elmina means the mine. But I was wondering, the Portuguese will not say Elmina, they will say Elmina.
You're right, Spanish
Right.
would say Elmina, yeah.
And I am reliably told that Elmina, in fact, is Arabic for the port.
Is that right?
Yes. And I've always been puzzled as to the reason why the Portuguese did not make landfall anywhere along this coast but this particular place. So I'm wondering if the Arabs already knew this place as a port, and that this had seeped into Europe. And so the Portuguese knew exactly where they were going. And they were going to the port, Elmina, right? Because they would say Elmina. If they're seeing the mine, they would say Elmina, not Elmina.
Huh, interesting. Yeah, anybody have any knowledge about this?
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I know that in Arabic, Elmina is the word for a port. So any coastal port across Africa is Elmina. I was thinking about the same thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
We have time for maybe just one last question.
So going back to what you said about the slave industry not being an illegitimate practice, when did that start to become like an idea this can be an illegitimate practice?
Well, people who study European history point out that in the Anglo-American historical narrative, anti-slavery societies were founded in the 1770s. Africanists are now starting to do research about anti-slavery movements in West Africa from at least then. And that's new research from dealing with the 18th century. What is more established is this kind of Anglo-American narrative that talks about anti-slavery societies from around the time of the American Revolution that had a lot of input from Africans in the diaspora, like Elmina, who was an anti-slavery activist. But certainly, to answer your question, no later than the late 18th century. People were definitely seeing, some people were seeing slavery as an illegitimate institution.
Everybody, let's thank our speaker.